Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the June 23rd Electric Toasters. Would you all please focus your eyes on my flag here, mute yourselves, and repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this point, I would normally turn it over to the Toastmaster, but I am the Toastmaster this morning. Today's theme is the greatest generation. This is a theme that I'd come up with, asked Kelly to go ahead and use for this morning. I recently, with the remembrance of D-Day, I'd gotten to thinking about this generation, the greatest generation, and I was trying to figure out, where did that term come from? I did a little research on it and found that in 1998, news anchor Tom Brokaw, NBC news anchor Tom Brokaw, actually coined this term. It's a term that will forever, I would say, forever frame a generation. Members of this generation were born into the early 1900s, really the teens and into the 1920s. And they were born into what really is a tech boom at the time. The invention of the radio had just happened. Car manufacturers were mass marketing automobiles for the first time, opening up new opportunities for this generation's parents to move from place to place and begin developing an economy. And unfortunately, what happened, I'm not real clear on exactly why this happened. My history is a little fuzzy, but shortly after this generation was born, the country entered into the Great Depression, a depression that is unlike one we've ever seen since. They had unemployment rates of up to 25%, which is unimaginable. Now the news goes crazy if we have unemployment rates in the 6%, 7%. I'm not even sure what they are right now. If that wasn't bad enough, on the tail end of this depression, the US was yanked right into World War II. At the time, this generation was very young, in their teens, early 20s, and millions of the young men of this generation flocked to the military and went overseas to fight in either the Pacific or European side of the World War II. Unfortunately, we lost nearly 300,000 men and some women in this terrible war. But what happened during the war was this generation learned how to be resilient. They learned how to start with nothing and turn it into something great. This generation, as I said, hundreds of thousands of men left the United States to go fight this war, leaving these massive holes in our workforce. And one of the notable things that happened, you're all aware of, is we brought women into the workforce from their previous lives, which was just homemakers. This forever has changed that workforce. And as we now see, this generation is responsible for that. Coming home from the war, despite losing over 300,000 US men and women, I mentioned that they took what they had learned to rebuild our economy. The economy was still depressed. They started putting their efforts towards rebuilding this economy. They developed what is known now as the interstate system, forever changing commerce in this country. They even sent people to the moon, which is something that my family really enjoys on hot summer evenings like we're having right now, is looking up at this night sky and seeing satellites and watching the space station go over once in a while. This generation was responsible for the development of all of those features. But when I think about the greatest generation, what I think about is my grandparents. This generation was my grandparents. It was many of our grandparents. And especially in summertime, I started thinking about stories my grandparents would tell about taking their kids, or my parents, out on summer vacations. All my family was from the Midwest, from Michigan area, and I recall lots of stories from my grandpa on my mom's side, taking my mom and her brothers and sisters up to northern Michigan for summer vacations. And the stories that he would tell were or they really developed kind of Norman Rockwell type imagery in my head. I would see small campfires, little pop-up tents, kids fishing off of a dock. It was just sounds like the most fantastic time. And when I think about the stories that they would tell, it reminds me of Toastmasters. One of the jobs for us as Toastmasters is to tell stories. And really, that's what I'm hoping to hear today in our table topics. Lloyd will get a chance later on today to ask some of us some questions about this great generation, and I'm hoping to hear some stories like my grandparents would have told. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the meeting to our general evaluator this morning, who is James Reynolds. Would you all please welcome James to the stage?
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to be the general evaluator today. I think this is my first, maybe second time in this role. And as the general evaluator, I will evaluate the meeting as a whole. And to help me do that, I have a team put together. So Matt, would you please tell us what you're going to do as the timer?
Thanks, James. I will be keeping track of time to make sure that everyone is aware of how long they've spoken for. And I'm assuming that is the speech 5 to 7. Yes.
Yeah.
Looking. Yes. Okay. So at 5, I gotta turn off my background. Forgot about that. 5 will be the green, 6 will be yellow, and 7 will be the red. And table topics be 1 to 2. So green at 1, yellow at 1.5, and the red at 2. And then with speech evaluation 2 to 3, the green at 2, 2.5 is yellow, and 3 is the red. And that's what I'll be doing. I'll report back at the end. Back to you, James.
Thank you, Matt. And today, Vicki has stepped up in the role of awe counter and grammarian. Vicki, can you tell us what you're going to be doing?
I will. Thank you very much. First, I'm going to start as grammarian. I have looked up a word of the day, and since we're talking about the greatest generation, I picked the word of the day to be exceptional. Exceptional is forming an exception or rare instance. And I did put it in the chat for everyone to remember. I will also be looking at use of language, and then as a counter, I will be listening to see if you have any filler words such as any repetitions, the word like, and so forth. And I will give a report at the end of my meeting.
Thank you, Vicki. Yeah, and I will report back at I give my report at the end of the meeting, the overall evaluation of the meeting. Thanks.
Yeah, James, before you go, I want to go ahead and describe what my role as speech evaluator will be. I see Mary's getting a little bit fidgety there, and I think she's really looking forward to what I'm about to say here. Mary is speaking out of the mentoring speech from level 2 of the visionary communication pathway. The purpose of this speech is to share the impact and importance of having a member. This speech is 5 to 7 minutes long, and I'll provide my evaluation a little bit later on in the meeting. Back to you.
And like I mentioned, I'll report back at the end. So back to Ian.
Thank you, James and evaluation team. This morning's speaker is Mary Cyree. Toastmasters International places a prime importance on the mentor-protege relationship. In fact, I gave a speech on this last week. The mentor provides guidance and support to empower proteges to reach their goals. The most successful mentors have been proteges themselves. Understanding the role of the protege is fundamental to being the best mentor you can be. Today's speaker, Mary Cyree, will recall a time when she was a protege and how that relationship impacted her speech. In her speech, Summer of 73, Mary Cyree in Summer of 73.
Good morning, Toastmasters. It's me, Mary, and I'm here to tell you a story of being a protege to a marvelous mentor. The only problem is I've never had a mentor. Have you? Maybe you haven't either. But we've all had a special person in our life that shared their life experiences and wisdom with us. These are the people who showed us a different way of viewing life. They gave us feedback that challenged us and yet was positive and supportive. They gave us a nudge when we needed a nudge. In lieu of a mentor, I went looking for people in my life who fit that criteria, and I call them micro mentors. Micro mentors weren't in my life for long, but they touched my life and they made a difference. Fellow Toastmasters, today I'm going to tell you a story of one of my micro mentors, a co-worker who worked with me during the summer of 73. This story takes me back to those post-high school years, which were the most challenging years of my life. These are the years where we're all asking ourselves, what are you going to be when you grow up? I had some major misconceptions about making life decisions. First one was, I didn't think I had any particular talents. You know, there's always those people who always knew that they were going to be a teacher or a doctor. I had no such inclinations. I also felt that whatever decision I made in a career, I was stuck with it. It was immutable, and that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And third, I was raised by my Depression era greatest generation parents to be self-reliant. I can still hear my mom saying, don't burden other people with your problems. Learn how to solve them yourself. Asking for help was not an option. What a cocktail, a toxic cocktail of self-defeat. This made the decision impossible. After 2 years of college, I was blocked. I was depressed and I didn't know how to move on. My plan in the summer of 73 was to drop out of college, earn enough money at my summer job so that I could put a backpack on my back and have a trip to Europe. My summer job in those years was at a food processing plant. And by the summer of 73, I'd landed a job in a USDA laboratory grading peas and in their cold storage facility. And working in the lab is where I met my micro mentor, Gary. Gary was a forklift driver. And this was his summer job too. The summer of 73 was our second summer working together. Both Gary and I were enrolled up at Western Washington State College in those days. And occasionally we would see each other on campus, wave, say hi. But it was at the cold storage facility that our friendship developed. One day during a lull in work, Gary came into the lab, probably to get warm. So Mary, he says, when I see you on campus, you're usually going into the chemistry building. So what are you majoring in? Are you going to go into nursing, chemical research or something? No, Gary, I don't know what to do, I said in my best Eeyore mopey voice. I can't decide on a major and I'm running out of classes to take. I had to sign up for something, so I just registered for the first year of chemistry classes. Gary was stunned. Mary, listen to me. I'm going to tell you something important that you need to hear. Nobody takes classes like chemistry because they don't know what else to do. People like that take classes like in communications or sociology. If you're taking chemistry as a filler class, it means you're good at it. And that's special because most people aren't. That was it. That was my micro mentoring moment. Gary taught me in that instant that the answer to what am I going to be when I grow up was to pay attention to what I was doing right then. I was working in a lab. I was taking chemistry classes for fun. Gary gave me a nudge when I needed a nudge. And what impact did this micro mentoring moment have on me? A year later, the summer of '74, after my trip to Europe, I enrolled in the medical laboratory technology program at Shoreline Community College. I worked in hospital labs, mostly chemistry, for 5 years. Then I changed careers and I became a software engineer. And later, another change when I became a technical project manager. Remember those major misconceptions I had about making life decisions? I don't have any talents to draw on. Well, I found out I was good at science, math, and problem solving. Whatever career I choose, I can never change. I had 3 distinct careers in my life. I was taught to be self-reliant and to not ask for help, but help is exactly what I needed. But I'm not going to discount self-reliance because every nudge from a mentor has to be followed by a decision and action from the protege. And that is the importance of the mentor, to give us their experience and life wisdom, to show us a different way of viewing life, and to challenge us. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Mary. Mr. Timer, would you please give us a minute on the clock so everyone can provide Mary with some feedback in the chat?
That's a minute.
This is the portion of the meeting where we get to talk. Well, we each get to participate in our table topics, and our table topics master this morning is Lloyd. Would you please welcome Lloyd?
Thank you, Ian. This is really an interesting meeting theme, and it's one that I've thought about a lot because my parents were members of the so-called greatest generation. By the way, if you have never read that book by Tom Brokaw, you should. You would really like it. It's also actually easy reading. It reads kind of like Brokaw always spoke, which is a kind of a folksy, regular guy type thing. But what he talks about in there is exactly what Ian was talking about in his introduction, how seemingly ordinary people, just average Americans, entered this period in US history that's almost unimaginable. I mean, think about it, the Great Depression and World War II back to back. That was like 20 years of existential crisis for the country that they lived through. And they overcame it. They came out the end of it and just went on with their lives as if that was just the way it went. Because for that generation, that was just the way it went. They had a sense of duty and sacrifice and like that. That notion of sacrifice is when I want to get this first question at. Picture a time when you would have a little coupon book, and if you wanted to buy sugar, you had to have a coupon for sugar in that book. If you didn't, you could not buy sugar. It didn't matter how much money you had. You could only buy a certain number of car tires per year. Didn't matter whether your tires wore out. If you didn't have a coupon in that book, you couldn't buy one. You could only buy a certain amount of gasoline every month. Didn't matter how far you had to drive. If you didn't have the coupon, no gas. Now, there was corruption and cheating. I mean, that's just the way some people are. But Matt, do you think that if we had a similar circumstance today where we really had to legitimately sacrifice day-to-day basic requirements, could we or would we be willing to do it like that generation did?
Thanks, Lloyd. That's a very good question. As you're kind of giving, well, I think both as Ian was giving his speech or the intro of the meeting and your similar kind of intro to the topic, it's kind of thinking our society, our global society is facing a lot of similar, well, not similar, facing a lot of existential threats right now. We're in the process of recovering from one of them, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've had that the COVID-19 pandemic has been one kind of test, I think, of that. There's been some things that were really easy to do, like masking, and some other things that are a lot harder to do, quarantining and things like that. And so we've had a kind of a test of that. And of course, it's been a mix, just like anything else. A lot of people did the right thing most or all the time. And then you had those who didn't. And I think that's probably as good of a, this has been as good of a analogy for kind of what you're asking as we've seen the folks that are willing to wear masks and those who aren't, and similar with quarantining. And so I think to more directly answer your question, unfortunately, there's a lot that wouldn't. And I hate to say that. I'd like to say that we would all rise to the occasion. But I think there's, but also I think there are a lot of people that did. And, as you go to the grocery store, most everybody was wearing masks and doing the things they were supposed to do. So I think there's a great deal of society that would. Thanks for the question, Lloyd.
Thank you, Matt. Another aspect of that greatest generation's experience, at least for the males, was universal military draft. Virtually anybody who was of draft age got drafted or voluntarily joined. Roughly half of the eligible males were not drafted because they joined. One of them was my Uncle Adam. He had a tough childhood. His mom died when he was 4 or 5 years old. His dad was an abusive drunk. And so Adam left the home and lived on the streets of Minneapolis from about age 14 on. He was a big guy, a big kid too. And when he was 15, he lied about his age in order to get into the Marines. And he went through basic training. They stuck him on a ship, sent him off to the South Pacific. And on his 16th birthday, he waded ashore on Iwo Jima with the Marines. He was shot before he reached the beach. They patched him up. He continued on in the fighting, was shot twice more. And when he came home, his attitude was, well, that's just the way it went. So we don't have a military draft right now in the US. We haven't had, I think it's 1972 when the draft was done away with. And so what we have is an increasingly, I'll say the word mercenary, but I don't mean it in the negative sense, a volunteer force which is dedicated to military, unlike everybody else. And almost no other male in the culture shares that experience anymore. So Ron, do you think if we were faced with a real live war type situation, would people be as willing to fight for the country as that generation was?
Boy, Lloyd, I have no idea. My initial thought is perhaps not. I think to a large degree, people have become soft with all of the technology that we have at our disposal to make our lives better without actually putting in work, without having to necessarily earn what we used to. One thing that comes to mind, back when I was a kid, is my parents would both work the entire year. Then we would take one vacation that was a week long. Sure, we had those family vacations, but it took a whole year of working and then saving, then prepping and going on a vacation. And it usually wasn't anything extravagant for us. It was typically within Washington State. We lived in Western Washington. We'd usually come over to Eastern Washington. There was a time that we went to Montana, it was summer of '73, I believe, Mary, but I was only 3, so I don't remember it all that well. Now you have folks that will go on multiple trips. They just come to expect that all this, recreation and entertainment is at their disposal. So to pull back from that and actually do something that's right and in the best interest of the country versus in the best interest from for themselves, I think we may be challenged at that. And I suspect if we're in a situation where we had to have troops to protect the country or to send overseas or what, Ian, there's 2 of you. It very well could be that the government would have to require people in a draft to do that. And I could be wrong. I'd hope I'm wrong, but that's my initial thoughts on the topic. Thank you, Lloyd.
Okay, thank you, Ron. We have time for about one more. One interesting feature of the Greatest Generation that I actually experienced when I was a kid, because when I was in elementary school and, well, actually all through school, because I graduated in 1966, almost all of my male teachers were World War II veterans, because everybody had served, every male had served pretty much in the war. And all of them had experienced the Great Depression and whatnot. But one thing that was common to them, and this was true of my mom and dad too, was that they did not expect to be regarded as heroic or having experienced tragedy. There was no wallowing in self-pity, what a tough life I had, no blaming whatever failings that they were in life on their experiences. So James, I'll ask you this. What has happened now? Because we're living in a world where everybody seems to come up with some excuse for every little thing. And that generation had a big thing that they could have tried to come up with an excuse for and didn't.
Another great question, Lloyd. I don't really have a particularly great answer. I mean, I shared some of those experiences, or I knew somebody from the Vietnam War who has now passed that was very similar to what you had described, as far as not even wanting people to know that he was actually in Vietnam or the experiences he went through. I think you could tell that, he went through some horrific things, but never said a word about it. It was actually very joyful individual to be around. He had a German Shepherd in a 1969 Dodge Charger, and on any given day you could see him driving down the road with his German Shepherd right beside him, and you make a goofy face or whatever. If he passed you, it had a 440 in it, so you weren't passing him. He made that a point. As far as this generation, and I think it might be a little bit of the technology too, the Facebook, all these reality TV shows where everybody wants to be recognized. So we don't have that as much as far as, just being heroic and not wanting the attention. It seems now in society, we're a little bit of attention getters. So I'd say that is part of it. And part of that comes from, some of the stuff you see, some of the stuff your kids watch, TikTok, all these types of reality shows. We seem to be just a little bit more selfish and want that, I guess, gratitude. We all want it. So we almost now live off of it and thrive off of it. Back to you, Lloyd.
Thank you, James. It is 7:30, so I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Ian. Before I do, though, one thing to think about on this topic is that the members of the greatest generation are obviously, well, they're all dead or they're very elderly. I read somewhere just recently that they're dying at the rate of about 2,500 per day. So in the not too distant future, there won't be any of them left. And you wonder whether the stories of what they went through are going to survive them, or whether we'll just forget them and move on. So with that happy thought, back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Lloyd. Great questions this morning. And I, for one, hope that those stories don't get lost. I know that I'll always remember some and be able to recount them to some level of detail to my kids, who will hopefully carry on those stories of their own. At this point, I'm going to call on our general evaluator, James, to kick off the evaluation portion of this morning's meeting. James?
Okay, thanks. I believe I'm going to kick it over to Ron for his evaluation of Mary's speech. Ron?
Okay, suppose I will take it away. As always, it is a pleasure to evaluate Mary's speeches. Mary does these very well. I think it's a bit of a challenge is coming up with anything to critique or to criticize about these speeches. Let's talk about what I thought was really good. I liked the content, the structure, the overall organization. There was a very clear introduction, a body, and a conclusion. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for every speech, but I like it more often than not when the presenter begins their intro and then there's a real clear transition by addressing fellow Toastmasters or Toastmasters and guests. And Mary did that. The transition to the conclusion from the body also tied back to the misconceptions that Mary identified in the introduction. I like that as well. As always, the gestures, the facial expressions, those head tilts, all those body language, Mary did a great job with that. Particularly like moving in and out of the camera. At one point, Mary moved back and kind of looked somewhat defeated, put her shoulders down and described her Eeyore mopey voice. I got a little chuckle out of that. I thought that was pretty fun. The one challenge, I believe, for this particular speech is the fact that Mary didn't have a mentor, but she dug pretty deep and identified Gary as a micro mentor. It's somewhat interesting. One of my first real supervisors was named Gary. Would I consider him a mentor? Not necessarily a micro mentor, perhaps. But what really came to mind with Gary and his impact for any Trekkies here that remember Star Trek: The Next Generation and the head groundskeeper at the Starfleet Academy, his name was Mr. Boothby. And for a groundskeeper, he's one of these really knowledgeable guys that sometimes had quite a bit of value or wisdom that he could pass on to the members of Starfleet that would come and speak with him. And I'm curious whether there's a little bit of that going on with Mary and Gary and the wisdom that he passed on to her. I don't want to take anything away from the grammarian, but there was a phrase in there, the toxic cocktail of self-defeat, that I want to try to remember and utilize. I thought that was really good. Never heard that before. And that's certainly a takeaway for me. Things to work on, boy, I think content-wise, the only thing I could suggest perhaps adding to this speech is if you could go find a great quote from somebody, some authority in mentoring, and add that. That could add some value. And also, typically, I've really liked your background, and the background is blurred. And for a presentation, I just prefer the background not to be blurred. But other than that, everything about this was great. And I certainly encourage you, Mary, to participate in more speech contests, because everything that I've seen and evaluated in my book is a complete winner. So thank you, and back to you, James.
Thanks, Ron. Next up is Vicky to give her account report and grammarian report. Vicky?
All right, thank you so much. If I missed something, I might have missed some ahs or some part of that. My dog was continually barking and I had to take care of that. But I think Matt used exceptional once, but I wasn't sure because the dog was barking at the time. And Ron was right on because I had wrote down the toxic cocktail that I wanted to address. Great job. And you also spoke of Eeyore, and then I think that it would have been more impactful if you just said my inner Eeyore rather than my Eeyore voice or what have you, because you really took on the persona of Eeyore. And so I think if you just said my inner Eeyore, that would have been great. For the and ums and so forth, Matt, I caught a couple ahs. Lloyd, you had repetition a couple times. One was in. And James, you snuck a in one of your sentences. Other than that, it was wonderful to hear all that. So back to you, James.
All right, now I'll kick it over to Matt for the timers report. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, James. Mary, the speech was 6 minutes and 51 seconds, and I timed my table topics at 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Ron, your table topics was 2 minutes and 1 second. James, 1 minute 45, and then Ron, your evaluation was 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Back to you, James.
All right. As a general evaluator, I think overall the meeting went very well. A lot of thought-provoking questions from Lloyd from the table topics. Everybody was on time. One thing I did notice, and that sometimes we miss, is no one timed Matt's table topics. So I guess having a backup timer might be something that we need to think about with such a small group. And the only other thing is, to me, I guess Ian's opening felt a little long. I don't know what the Toastmaster, is supposed to be. It just felt like it went a little bit long in my opinion. And that was it. I thought overall it was just a great meeting. And I think I fumbled through some things too, as being my first time with the general evaluator. And I left Ron out as the speech evaluator to kick things off. So that's it. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, James. Was this really your first time as general evaluator?
Online, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, first or second. Yeah. I need to sign. I usually go for the grammarian counter or timer roles. I need to step it up a little bit.
You did great. Thank you. At this point in the meeting, I'd like to recognize the fact that I skipped over the joke of the day. So if anybody has a joke of the day, please raise your hand. I'm not seeing any takers. All right, we can leave that for next week. I want to thank everybody for this morning's meeting. I don't see any guests, unfortunately. I'd like to know if anybody has any comments.
I do. I just wanted to say that this speech completes level 2 for my pathway. And I'm not sure whether to post it into our, DCP or not because of the club membership. If I post it, I think that we can get one more goal and be select or something. But if we don't have the members,
Yeah.
I will save it for next year. Lloyd?
Well, as someone who plays this strategy game with the DCP, unless we pick up 2 new members in the next 5 or 6 days, we're not going to be eligible for the DCP. So strategically, it would be better to bank the award, meaning just to wait until after the 1st of July to submit it on next year's. However, the award does belong to you since you earned it, so you can decide what to do with it.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Well, I'll wait a few days because they're already saying on the Toastmaster website that we are experiencing slowdowns and it only gets worse. So we can't wait till June 29th even.
Oh, no.
It has to be within a few days. So I'll just keep my ear to the ground. If we get a member, let everyone know.
Yeah.
ASAP, and I'll do that. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Mary. We also need to vote for our favorite speaker of the day. We can do that in chat. And
Send it
Go
to
ahead.
you.
yep, go ahead and send it to me. I was going to go ahead and send my own vote to myself, realized that was ridiculous. Lloyd, do you have anything to say from club coach perspective?
Nope, not really. This was
All
a
right.
weird year with the pandemic, and I think we actually came out of it pretty well considering what happened to several, 5 or 6 other clubs in the district who are I think gone, aren't they, Vicky? Didn't we lose 5 or 6 clubs?
We have, yes. And I think though that since we discussed it and it sounds like we're going to be online for a little bit longer as far as electric toasters, I've started reaching out to people who are not in the state of Washington but want to be Toastmasters, and they may be able, they might decide to join. So I'm still working on membership. We only need 2. And if you guys know anybody, be sure and invite them to next Wednesday's meeting, and we will definitely do the ask to see if they want to join right then so that we can get them in the books before the end of the Toastmaster year.
You weren't able to influence Tyler?
I am still working on him. I still have a few days to do that. He was helping his brother out this morning, so I gave him a pass because he was working with families.
If we did pick up 2 members, we would be a distinguished club. We already have the 5 goals. And it looks to me like there are only 3 or 4 other clubs in the entire district that are distinguished now. There might be a couple, 2 or 3 more, but it's not going to be the usual 30 or 40%. It's going to be more like 5%.
Yeah.
It's really, this was a tough year all over the world for Toastmasters.
Yeah.
All right. The tally was nearly unanimous. Everybody, please congratulate Mary on her great job this morning.
Thank you.
With that, I'll go ahead and adjourn this morning's meeting, and we will see you all back here next Wednesday.
Have a good week, everyone.